I used to spend around $200 a year on fertilizer, bags of general-purpose granules in spring, bottles of tomato feed in summer, grow more before planting, seaweed extract as a foliar spray, blood fish and bone worked into the beds in autumn. I had a shelf in my shed that looked like a small garden center, and I restocked it every season without ever questioning whether I needed to. Because that is what gardening magazines told me to do. That is what the instructions on every seed packet told me to do. Feed your plants, feed them regularly, and buy the products that let you do it. And then one afternoon, I dug into the corner of my compost heap looking for material to top dress a bed, and I found something that stopped me completely. The bottom 6 inches of that heap were not compost. They were alive, absolutely alive with worms, hundreds of them. Dense, dark red worms completely unlike the pale earthworms you find in garden soil, packed into a seething mass of activity that had turned the kitchen scraps and garden waste above them into something that looked and smelled like the finest, darkest, richest soil I had ever seen. I had been paying $200 a year for fertilizer, and the most powerful plant food on earth had been making itself for free in the corner of my garden. I just had not been paying attention. That afternoon, I stopped buying fertilizer. That was 6 years ago. I have not bought a single bag or bottle since, and my garden has never been more productive. What worm castings actually are and why nothing else comes close. Before I explain the system, I want to spend a moment on why worm castings are so extraordinarily valuable as a plant food. Because until you understand the biology, you might assume that compost or bought fertilizer does the same job. It does not. Not even close. When a worm eats organic matter, whether that is a piece of vegetable peel or a fallen leaf or a coffee ground, it passes that material through a digestive system that does something no industrial fertilizer process can replicate. It inoculates the material with beneficial bacteria, fungi, and microorganisms from the worm's gut. It breaks down the nutrients into forms that plant roots can absorb immediately without any further breakdown required. And it coats the finished casting in a layer of mucus that acts as a slow-release mechanism, meaning the nutrients do not wash away in rain the way soluble fertilizers do, but remain available in the soil for weeks and months after application. The result is a material that is not just high in nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, the 3 macronutrients that most fertilizers focus on. It is also high in calcium, magnesium, sulfur, and dozens of trace minerals that bought fertilizers either do not contain or contain in forms that plants cannot easily use. And it is alive in a way that no bag of granules will ever be, teeming with the microbial life that builds long-term soil health rather than just feeding the plant for one season. A study I came across some years ago found that plants grown in a substrate that was 10% worm castings produced 30 to 50% more yield than identical plants grown in the same substrate without castings. Not from a heavy application, 10%, 1 part castings in 9 parts of anything else. That is how concentrated the value of this material is. And it is being produced in your garden right now for free from waste that you are currently throwing away. The system. 1 bin, 1 species, 1 method. The worm system I run is deliberately simple. I made it complicated in the first year and it nearly failed. I bought a commercial 3-tier worm bin, filled it with bedding according to the instructions, added my kitchen scraps, and within 3 weeks, I had a bin full of wet, anaerobic, foul-smelling sludge and a population of worms that were trying to escape through every gap they could find. Because I had done what most beginners do. I had added too much wet material too fast, created conditions that were too wet and too acidic, and turned a simple biological system into a problem that needed solving. The system I use now costs almost nothing to build and has been running without a single failure for 5 years. I use a single, large plastic storage box, the kind with a lid, around 60 liters in capacity. I drill 1/4-inch holes across the bottom for drainage and airflow, and I drill the same holes across the lid for ventilation. I place the bin on 2 bricks over a tray that catches the liquid drainage, which I will come back to because that liquid is almost as valuable as the castings themselves. I fill the bin with bedding, which is simply torn up cardboard soaked in water and wrung out until it is damp but not dripping, mixed with a handful of garden soil and a layer of dead leaves. And then I add the worms. The species that matters is Icenia fetida, the red wiggler or tiger worm. This is not the common earthworm you find in garden soil. The common earthworm is a soil dweller that moves through the earth slowly and does not thrive in a confined bin. The red wiggler is a surface dweller and a voracious eater that has evolved to live in dense accumulations of decaying organic matter, exactly like the conditions inside a worm bin. It reproduces fast, tolerates a wide range of temperatures, and processes organic waste at a rate that the common earthworm cannot match. You can buy red wigglers online or from fishing suppliers who sell them as bait, typically a pound of worms for around $20 to $30. That is your one-time investment. Those worms will double their population every 60 to 90 days in good conditions, and within 6 months, you will have more worms than your bin can hold, at which point you divide them into a second bin or give the surplus away. Feeding the system. Once the worms are established and the bedding has settled for a week, you begin adding food. And this is where most people go wrong, so I want to be very specific about what to feed and what to avoid. The best materials for a worm bin are vegetable and fruit scraps, coffee grounds with the paper filter included, tea bags or loose tea leaves, crushed eggshells, cardboard torn into small pieces, newspaper, dead leaves, and garden trimmings that are not woody. These materials break down at a pace the worms can keep up with, and they maintain the slightly acidic, moist but well-drained conditions that red wigglers prefer. The materials that will destroy your bin are meat, fish, dairy, oily or cooked foods, citrus peel in large quantities, onion skins in large quantities, and anything that has been treated with pesticides. These materials either create the wrong pH, attract pests, or produce gases and heat as they break down that the worms cannot tolerate. I learned this the hard way in year 1. Now I keep a small container on my kitchen counter, and I fill it only with the right materials, emptying it into the worm bin every 2 or 3 days. The key rule I follow is to add a layer of torn cardboard every time I add food scraps. The cardboard absorbs excess moisture, adds carbon to balance the nitrogen in the food waste, and creates air pockets that prevent the anaerobic conditions that cause the smell and the failure that almost put me off worm composting permanently in year 1. Keep the carbon coming in every time you add nitrogen. That is the single most important rule in the system. Every 2 weeks, I check the moisture level by squeezing a handful of the bin contents. It should feel like a wrung-out sponge, damp but not wet. If it is too wet, I add more dry cardboard. If it is too dry, I spray it lightly with water. And I check that the worms are active and distributed throughout the bin rather than clustered in one corner, which usually means conditions in part of the bin are not right and need adjusting. Harvesting the castings. After 3 to 4 months of regular feeding, the bin will begin to fill with dark, crumbly, earthy-smelling material that is worm castings mixed with partially processed bedding. And harvesting this material requires separating the castings from the worms so you can use the castings in the garden and return the worms to the bin to keep working. The method I use is the simplest one I have found, and it requires no equipment. 2 weeks before I want to harvest, I stop adding food to one half of the bin and continue feeding the other half normally. The worms, which always move toward fresh food, migrate over the course of 2 weeks to the active half. I then scoop the castings from the quiet half, which by now contains very few worms, and use them in the garden. I refill the empty half with fresh bedding and begin feeding it again, which draws the worms back across over the next 2 weeks. And the cycle continues indefinitely. This method gives me a regular harvest of castings every 6 to 8 weeks without any complicated separation process and without losing significant numbers of worms. How to use the castings and the liquid. The castings come out of the bin as a dark, crumbly, earthy material with a smell that is genuinely pleasant, like forest soil after rain. Not like compost, not like manure, something cleaner and richer than either. I use them in 4 ways. First, I mix 1 part castings with 4 parts compost when potting on seedlings or filling containers. The seedlings grow noticeably faster and stronger than those raised in compost alone, and they need no additional liquid feeding through the season. Second, I top-dress my perennial vegetable beds in early spring by spreading a half-inch layer of castings across the surface and allowing the rain to work them into the soil. Third, I make casting tea by soaking a handful of castings in a watering can of water for 24 hours, stirring occasionally, and then using that liquid to water seedlings and young transplants. The resulting liquid is one of the most effective liquid plant feeds I have ever used, and it costs nothing. Fourth, I add a handful of castings to every planting hole when transplanting brassicas, courgettes, or any other hungry crop that needs a slow-release fertility boost at the root zone. The liquid that drains through the bottom of the bin into the collection tray is equally valuable and even more concentrated. I diluted 10 parts water to 1 part liquid before using it because undiluted it is too strong for most plants. But diluted, it is a complete liquid fertilizer that I use on everything from tomatoes to fruit trees to the lawn. I collect it every week or two and use it immediately. It does not store well, so I never let it accumulate. Between the castings and the liquid, one 60-liter worm bin fed on kitchen waste produces enough plant food to supply a garden of up to 10 raised beds through a full growing season. My garden has 8 productive beds, and I have been running on worm castings and casting tea alone for 6 years. Not supplementing with bought feed. Running entirely on the output of one bin and the kitchen scraps that used to go in the food waste collection. The numbers that matter. 1 pound of red wigglers costs $20 to $30 as a one-time purchase. The bin itself, a 60-liter storage box, costs $10 to $15. 2 bags of compost for initial bedding cost around $10. Total startup cost, under $60. That same pound of worms will process around half a pound of food waste per day within the first month and up to a pound per day by month 3 as the population grows. Over a full year, one mature worm bin processes 200 to 300 pounds of kitchen and garden waste that would otherwise go to landfill and converts it into 15 to 20 pounds of worm castings and several gallons of casting liquid. At retail prices, 15 pounds of worm casting sells for $40 to $60 in garden centers. The casting liquid, sold as worm tea or liquid worm fertilizer, sells for $15 to $25 per liter. The combined retail value of what one bin produces in a year is somewhere between $150 and $250. From a one-time investment of under $60 and kitchen scraps that cost you nothing because you were generating them anyway. I spent $200 a year on fertilizer for 5 years before I built this system. That is $1,000 I paid for something I could have been making for free the entire time. And the fertilizer I was buying was not as good. It was not building my soil biology. It was not releasing nutrients slowly through the season. It was not alive. It was just chemistry. And chemistry feeds the plant for one season. Biology builds the soil for 20 years. There is a shelf in my shed that used to hold 12 different bottles and bags of fertilizer products. It is empty now, has been for 6 years, and my garden is more productive than it has ever been. The tomatoes are bigger, the kale is darker, the fruit trees are carrying heavier crops. Not because I am adding more, because I stopped adding the wrong things and started feeding the biology instead of just the plants. One bin, one species. Kitchen waste you are already producing, and a continuous supply of the finest plant food on earth for every bed you own for free for as long as you choose to keep running the system. You have been throwing the ingredients for this away every single day. You just did not know what they were worth. Start the bin this week. In 4 months, you will have your first harvest of castings, and you will never buy fertilizer again.